You may be aware that port wine comes in many varieties. There's white, ruby, rosé, tawny, aged tawny, late bottled vintage, also known as LBV. And then there is vintage port. That's the big kahuna, the pinnacle of port wine, the absolute best. And it's not made every year. In fact, the last one was declared in 2018. But what does declared even mean? Today, you will learn how and why port vintages are declared from Adrian Bridge, whose house has been making port for over 300 years. All right, so today our guest is Adrian Bridge. Adrian is coming from Portugal, quite a long way here from the United States. And today we are talking about vintage port. And Adrian, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today.
Joe, it's an absolute pleasure. We're not actually that far, to be honest. We're the same distance from New York as LA is, so it's just the other side of the pond.
It's a quick trip, huh?
It is very quick, yeah.
Our listener probably is somewhat familiar with port and probably has heard of vintage port, but today we want to talk a little bit about what goes into a vintage port. And taylor-fladgate is probably one of the references for vintage port. It's one of the most legendary houses. Maybe we could start. So, first of all, Adrian, you don't sound like you're Portuguese.
Well, we're very educated here in Portugal.
Ah,
No,
that's what it is.
no, look, I'm English, and of course, Taylor-Fladgate, is a British company. We're now a 334-year-old family company, so it's been passed down through the generations, often through the female side. So hence, the surname doesn't necessarily match with that. In fact, we have a Mr. Taylor was only involved in the company for a very short period of time, but it was when the port started to be branded and shipped with a brand, and that's why it's Mr. Taylor's port. Taylor-Fladgate in America, but other parts of the world, it's just called Taylor's with that apostrophe S, implying that it came from Mr. Taylor. So, yeah, the British people were involved very much in developing the Douro and creating the port industry globally. We still tend to be the people who are leading the quality port. So we tend to look at port as being what we call special category ports, which would be vintage port, single quintas, aged tawnies, LBVs, white ports, pink port, things like that, rosé port. Those would be special category ports, reserve ports like bin 27 or something like that. But that represents something like 25% of the volume of the industry, but over 50% of the value. And it's that part that we really focus on. And certainly we have a reputation as being one of the most iconic of the vintage port houses, where the quality of a vintage port and the style of a vintage port are all hugely important factors, which hopefully we'll get into.
Absolutely. So, where did the idea of the vintage port, when did that start?
Well, that's a super question because if you go prior really to about 1800, port would have been made, shipped in barrels, and was not designed to age in a bottle. So if it did see a bottle at all, it was often by way of a service from taking it from a barrel and putting it in a bottle to put it on somebody's table. So in a sense, early bottles were much more decanters than they were things that you could store in. By around about 1790, 1800, a conventional shaped bottle that we would have today was created. And the idea of therefore being able to store lying down on its side, allowing the cork to stay moist, and therefore having the wine able to mature without any risk of spoilage through oxidation, it became something. The love of port really then kicked off soon after that with the British Army, who were involved here in the Napoleonic Wars, were operating in Portugal for a number of years. And indeed, as the King of Portugal and his whole court left Lisbon for Brazil, the British essentially ran Portugal all the way through till 1826. And that really cemented not just or continued the love of port, but also cemented this new style of port, which is vintage port, something that can age in a bottle. And then you go on through the 19th century to legendary vintage ports, through right through the last century, and then now into this year or this century, where we've had a number of extremely fine vintage ports.
Whoa, that's a lot of history.
Well, apologies for too much history, but the point is to put it in context
Yeah.
is both in terms of the fact that it can be aged, and this is one of the things about vintage port. So vintage port represents the very pinnacle of what we do. Effectively, we work in our vineyards to try to make vintage port out of every grape that we grow. So we have a philosophy of trying to shoot for that very top of the port industry. Bearing in mind, vintage port is less than 1.5% of the entire port industry, so it's a very small niche, but it's the highest quality and it's the most ultimate expression of a port company, of their style, and certainly quality and the ability to age. And these aren't always the same for port companies. Some companies, might make ports that are very nice when they're young, but they simply don't age. Others, and I think what we're seeing increasingly today is that other producers, particularly if I look at taylor-fladgate, our ports are much more attractive when they're young than perhaps they used to be 30 years ago, but they still have the aging potential that they've always had. And that's really come about because of one of the unique ways that we make port is this process of fortification. Fortification, all ports fortified, fortification happens because we add a neutral grape spirit into the fermenting must, and that raises the alcohol level from about 7 all the way up to 20. Yeast cells die when the alcohol gets above about 15. So you kill off all the yeast cells. In other words, you stop the fermentation and you get left with unfermented grape sugar. And that's really all that spirit, that fortifying spirit, does. In our particular case, for our finest grapes, which we grow on our own vineyards, we choose a very expensive spirit, a very pure spirit, a spirit that even when you taste young vintage ports, you wouldn't know they're 20% alcohol, because you've just got these lovely pure spirits. We buy them in Bordeaux. Some of the best distillation capacity in the world is in Bordeaux, and serves the cognac industry. So, but many companies, just use the spirit they would use for normal ports, and those tend to be a bit rougher. If you go back 30 years, we used to have to buy the spirit from the Portuguese government, but the quality wasn't the same as we can get today. And it's that change in spirit, the work that sort of David Gimmerines, our head winemaker, has done in the last 30 years on spirit, which is really making a huge difference to the attractiveness of vintage port as something that you could drink younger without sacrificing any of its aging capacity.
That's something that I doubt anybody really knows about, the pureness of the spirit. What vintage did it start where you weren't buying from the Portuguese government, where you could use your own spirit?
1992.
Huh.
So, the way I think about spirit, and this is kind of the way I can describe it to people, is that imagine you're a great painter and you want to paint a beautiful picture. You go down to the art store and you say, could I have a piece of canvas? And they come out and they say, well, we've got this quality canvas and we've got this much more expensive quality, but it's going to last forever. Now, you as the painter are going to say, well, I'm kind of painting a painting for my kids. It doesn't really matter that the painting falls apart in a few years' time. Or you're saying, I am the new Michelangelo, and I'm going to produce a painting that I still want to be hanging on the walls of a palace in 100, 200 years' time. I'm going to buy the best quality canvas I can. The canvas holds the paint. The canvas can degrade, but the canvas only holds the paint. The picture is created by the artist. In many ways, the spirit is like that. The spirit has this function of stopping the fermentation, but once you put it into the fortifying process, means that once it's in the must, the spirit is there forever.
Right.
20% of a bottle of port started as spirit. It's there forever. So, like a canvas, it's there forever behind the picture. So, if you want to really make top quality, you've got to spend the money, make the selections, and do the work on the spirit. And that's what, as I say, David Gimrans, our head winemaker, has really been working on hugely in the last 30 years, since we no longer had to buy spirit from the Portuguese government.
Interesting. So, do you and the winemaker, do you actually taste the spirit, or how do you judge the quality of it?
Yeah, so David actually would go to Bordeaux with our spirit producers and would sit and do tastings and make selections in order to really choose for the very highest quality that we can get. That process normally happens in about February, and those spirits are then delivered into here, in the summer before the August period. And then, of course, harvest for us was normally September, and spirit is applied. So it's, when you're making port, you pick your grapes. 3.5 days after picking is when you're adding that spirit. So everything's got to be worked out well in advance, and we get absolutely ready. And increasingly these days, harvests are starting earlier because of climate change.
Sure.
So that selection process does have to happen early on, and it makes a huge difference. And we taste that, in the wines.
Huh. So you're actually choosing the spirit every year? It's not like a spirit that you just get and you store and then like you have it?
We buy it every year. Remember, it's a grape spirit. It's a natural grape spirit.
Right.
It's made, in fact, from the distillation of white wine.
Huh.
As I say, the best distillation capacity is there in the Cognac region, just north of Bordeaux, because to make cognac, they also need a spirit, which they
Sure.
then obviously age in wood and create. The cognacs, and the finest cognacs from that region will be buying the finest spirits. The finest ports, like vintage port, are buying the finest spirits that are made in the cognac region. And but remember, they're neutral. They have no flavor. They are just distilled white wine, and it takes 7 liters of white wine to make 1 liter of the neutral grape spirit, which we would call it, to give it its full name, just a neutral grape spirit.
Huh. Fascinating. And you've said a couple times now that the aging potential of port and vintage port specifically. Now, I remember hearing that vintage port you could buy it like a case of vintage port for your birth year, and by the time you're able to drink in the United States, it's 21 years old. Like it would just start to be ready to drink, and you could like drink it for the rest of your life. Is that true? Like, can you really drink a port for like 40 years, 50 years?
Absolutely. What we call a declaration. So this is when we have, something like the taylor-fladgate. It's actually blended from a number of our different properties. It's a year when we think, when we call it taylor-fladgate, we really think it's going to be a very long-lived wine.
Right.
So, I know that for many consumers that might be listening and say, well, do I need a wine that, is going to be great in 50 years time? I want to drink it now, or I want to drink it in 10 years time. The answer is you can. And that's kind of the point I was making
Right.
about the spirit. And I think that's what's changed in recent years. But you're absolutely right that in many cases, people do buy. There's not many wines you could buy in the year of your birth, confident that you will be able to enjoy it through your lifetime. Vintage port is one of those. But the thing is, we don't make vintage port every year. So we've just declared the 2024. This is our new vintage port. It's the first new vintage port since 2018. And then, across the industry, most people are making the 2024s. And the last year when most people made was 2017. So you can see, wines of this quality don't come along every single year. And, when they're there and they're exceptional, then we tend to do this process of what's called a declaration.
Right.
And for us, traditionally, that happens on St. George's Day.
Right. And that's what we're here to talk about. It's not just the declared vintage ports that come from Taylor-Fladgate. There are other wines that you make that have a vintage on them. So I think maybe that's where some of the confusion comes in, and why the declaration we need to like kind of talk about a little bit. So maybe you could kind of just give us an idea of what makes the difference between some of these like single quintas, or like recently the Sentinels you came out with a vintage on it.
Yeah. Basically, the way to think of it is when we make what we call a declared vintage, and that would be one that would be sold with just saying taylor-fladgate, we're choosing ports that we made from right across our different properties, making a blend, which we think is something that is, it's not only epitomizes the house style of Taylor's, and we'll get into that in a moment, but also has the capacity to age. And when we think about something that's aging, we are thinking of something that is going to be there for 40, 50, 60 years. The reality of the wine industry typically is we make our best wines from the grapes and vines that were planted, from the vines planted by a previous generation, and we plant today for future generations. Actually, with vintage port, when we make it today, it is future generations that are going to be defending the decision we made, that we took to actually make that vintage port, because they're so long lived. So I often do tastings, where we might taste back to the 1970 or the 63, or maybe as far back as the 1945, which is now, significantly old port. There's not much of it around, but it's still extraordinarily drinkable and very beautiful wines. They're pretty expensive now, those older vintage ports. And that's why lots of people when you get a new declaration, which doesn't happen that often, people do like to buy them and tuck them away, because they may not be there in 10 or 20 years to buy, when you suddenly decide you do want to open it for your the 21st birthday of your son or daughter or whatever.
Right.
They're not available. So that's why people tend to buy it now and tuck it away in the cellar, for the future.
Sure. So maybe you could talk a little bit now about the actual declaration. I know you said that some houses declare certain vintages, but I think there's some kind of cooperation with some of the other port houses to decide on some of these declared vintages, such as the
Not
2024.
really. No, 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 no. I mean, it sort of gives the impression from the outside that there's some sort of cabal of port shippers sort of getting together in sort of some smoky club room with our sort of, thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether we're going to make a declaration. And it doesn't really happen like that.
Okay.
The reality is this: is that we try to make vintage port every year,
Right.
and that's our objective.
Right.
When we do, it's typically because all of the elements have come together. That means in the sense of having, the right amount of rain in the winter, or having things like the bud burst, when the vines wake up from their dormancy. And, in the 2024s, that happened fairly early in March. We had a good spring, but without too much rain. It wasn't too hot, which allowed the yields. The amount that each vine produced was a little bit lower, because it was a fairly cool spring and early summer. But then, from July onwards in 2024, we had a long dry period right the way through to the end of the harvest. So what this meant was that, the grapes were able to fully mature, and then even into harvest, you had perfect conditions, to pick the grapes. You didn't have rainfall, you didn't have any dilution. So you end up with a year which is very, very high quality, not a lot of quantity. And realistically, because the Douro region is relatively small, if it's good for one company, it's probably good for another company.
Got it.
And that's why, what we would call a general declaration, in other words, most people should have been able to make a vintage port in 2024. The quality of the grapes were there. Obviously, it then comes down to the winemaking capabilities, and then ultimately to the blending process and the ability of the winemakers, the tasters, the blenders. We have a blending panel, which is 11 of us who sit on that panel, where we would be trying to fine tune the blend to get the very best quality expression of taylor-fladgate that we can.
Okay. So you just declared the 2024 vintage. That happened 2 years ago. So At what point did you really decide, like, oh, this is going to be a port, this is going to be a vintage that we're going to declare? Does that happen like relatively close to the date of the declaration, or is it?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question because again, from the outside, it seems a little bit confusing. And you see
Yeah,
other wine regions, I mean, Bordeaux always just talks about the harvest that just took place.
sure.
And why are we a year later? Well, the idea is this, is that we do a harvest. We make all of our ports. We then leave them up in the Douro for the winter. The Douro is the interior part away from the influence of the city, the ocean here in the city of Porto. In the interior, much colder winters, much hotter summers. You leave it there for that first winter. The wines close up. We would then normally taste during January, February following a harvest and decide which wines that we made, which ports that we made are actually potential for vintage port.
Hmm.
And we put those to one side. We then come back a year later after a second winter and then essentially determine what we're going to do with them. That's when we start to put a blend together. And normally that would happen around February. We would be tasting through February and March, putting the blend together. It often depends how warm the year is. If you have a warm start to the year, the wines then tend to open up from having that cold winter. They open up a little bit more, a bit more expressive, and that makes it easier to put a blend together. And so that process for us really takes place through the month of March. So that's what we were doing this March, and having put that blend together, we then what we call marry it. So essentially, having decided on the blend, we then put it all together in a big vat because it would have all been in component parts. We put it into one big vat, and that then will declare on St. George's Day, and I'll come on to that in a moment. We would then bottle normally in around late June, early July, and then we would deliver it to the markets.
Hmm. And it's been quite a while since the last vintage declaration. Were there any years in the past 7 or so that you thought, oh, this is going to be a declaration, and then you decided at the last minute, nope, nope,
Yeah,
not going to be it?
what happens is we typically put wine aside every year
Right.
that we think could have the potential, and then sometimes it doesn't happen, but other times we think that this is really good, but it isn't a Taylor-Fladgate declaration, and
Okay.
as a result, we might make it as a single Quinta vintage port. So it's still a vintage port, but it's marketed as something like taylor-fladgate, Quinta de Vargelas, or a recent product we have, which is taylor-fladgate Sentinels,
Hmm.
which is a wine that has all the quality hallmarks, but perhaps isn't going to be quite as long-lived
Oh, okay.
as a classic. So that's really the difference. So we would look at something like I take Sentinels as an example because we actually made Sentinels this time as well. Sentinels probably as a mature drink will be mature by about 10 years of age,
Wow.
whereas the classic will be mature at 20 years, as you mentioned earlier. The classic would go on to last 50 or 60. The Sentinels mature at 10, but probably a lifetime of maybe 30, 35 years. So it's a little bit earlier maturing, and that's because it hasn't got quite the same density, we feel. I mean, some people, not everyone agrees with our decision,
Sure.
as it
Yeah.
were. Some people think, well, hang on, this is a hell of a good wine. Why,
Yeah.
why didn't you declare this?
Right.
You go, well, okay, well, we didn't. I mean, there's plenty of years in the past where that's happened, where people have said, you should have declared this. And you go, well, in hindsight, you're probably right, but we didn't. And the reason, there is a reason for that, because as I've said already, we are defending these ports today, but you know, my children, my grandchildren will probably be defending the decisions we've made. And so you don't want to leave them with a vintage port that doesn't make it up to the standard that you would normally get from a taylor-fladgate. So as a result, we tend to be hugely cautious and tend to make less and make it less frequently. And that's just the kind of the approach we take. We are, I guess, having managed to be in business for 334 years,
Yeah.
we've got a few things right,
You
but we're
got something right.
probably also a little bit cautious at times because you are defending a legacy. And, and it's important that we do, and a lot of traditions. And I do want to, when we talk about vintage port, to get onto traditions because we've already mentioned a couple of times, St. George's Day.
Yeah.
We declare on St. George's Day.
Yep.
That is an ancient tradition that we started back in 32 years ago. Um,
Okay.
an ancient tradition started 32 years ago. Why did we do it? Well, it was really in response to lots of people asking us, "Are you going to make a vintage porter? You're not going to do it." So on and so forth. If so, can we have samples? We want to taste. So you get journalists and certainly magazines, particularly there in the United States. You have magazines that rate wines, and they want to be the first out to rate and to talk
Of
about
course.
them.
Yeah.
And so everybody wants samples earlier and earlier and earlier. And we said, like, well, for us, we don't want to feel any pressure in making our decision because we need to get a sample out to journalist A or journalist B. So we said, look, there's a really good day. It's called the 23rd of April. It is St. George's Day. It is the saint, patron saint of England. We're a British company. It makes sense. Well, that's the day we'll declare. From that day, we'll be able to provide samples and really talk to people about these. But up until that moment, please respect that we need the time to make the blend, make our decisions, and sort things out without the pressure of everybody wanting to know. And that's how that came about.
Okay.
And it's worked for us, ever since. So we kind of keep that. We know that a lot of our competitors try to get ahead of the 23rd of April because they want to sort of say they declared first,
Oh, right.
and oh, we did, and then Taylor-Fladgate followed on and go, yeah, look, guys, we know what we do. At the end of the day, it's the wines that will speak in terms of quality rather than the day in which you necessarily decided to launch.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like there's a rush to make the declaration like a race. And it also sounds like when Taylor Fladgate declares vintage, like it is definitely like it's definitely going to be a fantastic wine that's going to last a very long time. But as you hinted, some of these other years they might be vintages that weren't declared but may last 30 or 40 years anyway because
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
just have such high standards.
Exactly. I think that's the point. We have a reputation. So when we declare it, it is big news.
Yeah,
So, therefore having a date to focus around, we think also makes a lot of sense. And why has Taylor Fladgate got this reputation, and what is the house style? Because all ports kind of have a house style,
sure.
and Taylor's has got this sort of they're quite reserved. There's a lot of elegance. They are a little bit British in the sense that they're probably a little bit upright, a little bit tight. The tannins are very you kind of got these tannins which are very dense, very coiled, almost graphite tones in there as well. A lot of energy, but they're not tannic. They're not aggressive.
Hmm.
They're not drying in the mouth. They're not. You haven't got high astringency, but you've got this real power and elegance, this real poise. It's a lovely word where you've got everything's really in balance, and you're always looking for that balance between the fruit, the structure, the acidity, the what we call mouthfeel, this sort of length across the palate. You want to, when you drink a vintage port, you want this initial sensation as you taste it, and you probably taste the fruit first, and then you'll find it wash over the tongue and fill your mouth with this sort of explosion of fruit, but then this big structure and power and tannins, and then it'll roll across the tongue, and you'll discover all these lovely layers in the wine. And then it's still going to be there talking to you. You'll swallow it,
Yeah.
and then it's still there on the palate, still communicating, its layers, its subtlety, its complexity. And it's all of those things that really come together to make something really special. One of the things people used to describe sometimes vintage port as being like a iron fist inside a velvet glove. So
Hmm.
because you have all this texture and softness and richness, and yet there's a firmness and a structure, and it's that firmness and structure that, of course, is going to mean that it'll last for a very long time. But if it doesn't have fruit and richness at the beginning, it'll never pick up fruit, and
Right.
that's why that balance is so important.
The way you're describing it, Adrian, it sounds more like an event than just having a sip of wine.
But that's wines like this are liquid history.
Yeah.
Let's we haven't done a Taylor Fladgate Classic declaration since 2018. I
Yeah.
mean, I sincerely would wish that they came around every year, but they don't. They come around when we think the stars have aligned and we've got something that is amazing, and we'll make it. And in this case, this time around, we haven't got very much. We've only been able to make about 6,000 cases And we've got to spread that across a world that hasn't had a Taylor-Fladgate, classic vintage for the last 8 years. So,
Yeah.
there's going to be probably more demand than our capacity to supply. That's why you'll find that a lot of merchants and importers will make an offer, will essentially sell it on paper, and then deliver maybe in September, October,
Sure.
but to people who've already made their purchasing decisions.
So it actually is an event getting a chance to taste this wine. So toward that, normally we talk about on this podcast the different foods you want to pair with wine. If port is so complex and luxurious and like such an experience, would you want people to have any kind of food when they're tasting a vintage port?
I mean, why not? I think, if you, the great thing about a pairing is if you can put things together that individually are interesting, but combined are even more, then that's what makes pairing worthwhile. I think obviously with vintage port, you can drink it on its own. It's an intellectual wine, so
Yeah,
you can enjoy it and think about it.
right.
But if you don't want to do that, you just simply want to enjoy it because maybe it's the year you were born. You're having a party. You're saying, "Look, hey, this is the wine in the year I was born. So let's, not think about it too much. Let's just enjoy this beautiful piece of history, that comes from the year I was born or whatever." But last night I was hosting a group of people in a restaurant we have here in Porto, where we pair young vintage port with steak.
Oh,
So we bring it into the main course. It's like, how does that work?
huh.
Well, the answer is when you've got a lovely rich steak, big juicy, and maybe a little bit of salt on it, and then you pair that with a young vintage port, which has got all this dense fruit and this structure, and these lovely layers, which will get through all that juicy meatiness as well. But then the sweetness of the vintage port offsetting, there's that little touch of sort of salt that you've got on the steak. That combination is extraordinary. It's not a combination most people think about because, of course, they go, oh, well, vintage pork comes at the end of the meal, so I'm going to have it with my dessert or I'm going to have it after my dessert. But actually, you can bring it in and pair it with some extraordinary things. And something as simple as a really good steak is an amazing tasting experience. I'm not
Yeah.
saying you should do that every time, but if you've never tried it, I would certainly highly recommend it as something to try.
I think I'll try vintage port with anything. Just get me some vintage port.
Yeah. Well, it goes, I mean, a lot of the traditional things people would think about would be pairing it with a blue cheese.
Yeah,
Port and Stilton has always been a sort of famous
sure.
combination of pairing. Chocolate is also very good. Remember, chocolate is quite bitter, and particularly the darker the chocolate. So if you're having a rich dark chocolate dessert, it will be bitter. That's why red wine typically doesn't taste so good with chocolate because the chocolate's tannic and a red wine is tannic. And that's why port manages to fill that gap because there is the lusciousness of the fruit in port, despite having, being big and having the tannic structure, but it's also got this lusciousness of fruit, which in fact works incredibly well with chocolate, I say, particularly a darker chocolate. So that's a pairing that people look to. I think it's an amazing pairing. But, these are also wines that you could just simply enjoy on their own. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you for walking me through the whole vintage port declaration process. But what's been going on in Portugal lately? Because I keep seeing everybody visiting Portugal and moving to Portugal. It's like the hot place to be. And I feel like you're kind of like the mayor of Portugal because you're such an ambassador.
Well, it's a fun place to be. I mean, obviously we moved here 334 years ago and didn't leave. So I guess we
It
could we
must be
could
nice.
certainly early pioneers of coming here. Look, I think the reality is this. Portugal is it's a beautiful country. It's a relatively small country from top to bottom. It's sort of 600 miles long and 180 miles wide. So in a fairly small country, you go from Atlantic coast beaches to historic cities to mountain ranges to glorious vineyard landscapes like the Douro Valley. So there's an incredible richness here of history, culture, landscape. It's on the edge of Europe. It's actually relatively close to the United States. I've said, if where I'm sitting here in Porto, it's a question of coming out of New York. Do you turn left and come to Porto? Do you turn right and go to LA? I mean, it's that distance. But people are coming. I guess Portugal, apart from all of that it offers, and it does also offer very good value. which I think people appreciate. I think it's also got a uniqueness. So it hasn't become overly constructed and very modern. There's still a lot of authenticity here. It's got incredibly friendly people. It hasn't really upset anybody since about the 16th century.
Yeah.
So, nobody, you haven't got lots of people who say, "Oh, I don't like Portugal." We're a happy, calm place. We're really safe and secure. Great health system, great climate, great history,
Yeah.
great wines, some fabulous food as well. So lots of people coming. And it's to your question, what does that mean? I mean, if I go back, say, 15, 20 years, we got probably 20,000 Americans a year used to come to Portugal. Last year, there are about 2 million.
Oh.
So there's been a complete transformation. But the advantage is they're spread across the whole year, across the whole country. So it's not like you're going to bump into your neighbors here.
Right.
But what you will find is that because of that traffic, you can now fly direct out of Newark, out of JFK. You can fly direct to Porto out of Boston. You can fly from many more cities in America straight to Lisbon and then come up to Porto. So we're really accessible, and I think people are coming here and really appreciating this new and relatively undiscovered destination with lots of unique and different things to do and a very, very authentic experience. And that's helping us not only, in a sense, expose people to ports and tell the story of port, but it also means lots and lots of people are trying to buy Portuguese table wines. They come here, they try it, and they go, "That's amazing. Where can I get it when I go home?" And you'll find lots of really good Portuguese table wines available, often at very good value compared to some other parts of the world. So they're becoming increasingly more popular. We our own company make a few.
What? So yeah, actually, let's get into that real quickly. What are some of the wines that Americans can find over here that you make that might be enjoyable?
Yeah, so I live and work in the town of Porto, and about an hour and a half north of here, we have what's called the Minho region. It's up on the Spanish border. Anyone who's been doing the walk for the pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago will kind of walk through the Minho, and that's a place that's famous for the Alvarinho grape variety. And so we have a couple of those we make. One is called Graça de Pedra, and the other is called Milagres. And Milagros in Portuguese means miracle, and that's the sort of top wine. And a graça is a small miracle. So the Graça de Pedra or Milagros de Quinta de Pedra. So that's kind of the hierarchy of those. And that's Alvarinho, so that's really fresh and clean and lovely white wine.
Yeah.
But if I go an hour or so south of where our office is, we get to a region called Bairrada. And Bairrada, we make wines like Principal, which is, you've heard of Super Tuscans.
Sure.
You've got wines from Spain like Vega Sicilia, which is a Bordeaux blend,
Yeah.
but made in Spain.
Right.
Now, this was a project started back in the 90s with the aim of making a super Portuguese, and it's one of the sort of three most iconic wines that are produced in Portugal. And what makes it special, I mean, it is a blend with 50% Touriga Nacional, which is a great variety, a Portuguese grape variety, but the other 50% would be Cabernet Sauvignon, probably 40% Cabernet Sauvignon, 10% Merlot. And that's a really interesting combination. It's a combination people are going to see increasingly now that in Bordeaux they have authorized Touriga Nacional to be planted in Bordeaux because it's very resistant to heat.
Oh.
But really lovely wines. It's on an old seashore that's about 30 kilometers from where the ocean is now, but it's chalk. And if you think about chalk vineyards, some of the best vineyards in the world are on chalk. When you think of Champagne, it's all chalk. If you think of Burgundy, pretty much all chalk. So some of the great vineyards of the world are on chalk. And this is where our vineyard is. It's like a snake across the landscape, which is the old seashore with all this lovely chalk, producing this wine called Principal.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a second wine of Principal called Calcario. Calcario is the Portuguese word for limestone. And in fact, if you look at the label, it allows us to spell out CaCO3, which is the chemical formula for the limestone as well. So it's called Calcario. It's very visible. Right. You'll find that in the States as well. And so that, there's a couple of examples there. And then obviously wines that we have from the Douro itself, like Quinta de Portal is a brand we have, which is making some really excellent Douro table wines. So They are available, and I think you increasingly will see them available all around the country as people discover and really begin to look at Portuguese wines with the excellence that they deserve.
Now I feel like I need to bring you back another day to just talk about Portuguese table wines.
I would love to do that whenever we can. We can also talk about some of the amazing, food pairings. The fact that you might want to have your alvarinho with your grilled sardines on a
Oh,
nice hot day when they got the barbecue out.
sounds good.
That would be very Portuguese, very traditional, and a really good combination. But maybe we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, let's save that for another day. That sounds amazing. Wow, Adrian, this was fantastic. I definitely learned a lot today. I hope our listener did too. Any last things you want to talk about regarding vintage port and the 2024 vintage that's coming out?
Well, Joe, no, thank you very much for your time and this opportunity to talk. I think, we're going to be doing a bit of a roadshow there. I think I'm due over with you in early May, where we're going to take this to New York, Chicago, and then over to, I think we're going to San Francisco. We're able to talk, therefore, to a number of press and some key customers. And I think, therefore, you'll start to see soon after that quite a lot of people talking about the 2024 vintage. It'll turn up in all the main wine magazines, and hopefully we'll then be able to have some events where consumers can taste it, and it's exciting.
Yeah.
A new vintage, it's like having a new baby in the family. It's like, whoa, we've now got a new kid. Let's go and introduce him to the older siblings, but let's get him out and show him.
Yeah.
Beautifully, wrapped in swaddling clothes. This is our latest edition, and that's what's going to happen in early May when I'm over in America.
Ah, this is going to be really exciting. Thank you so much. I've one more silly question.
Which is,
St. George, did he drink port?
uh, I'm sure he did, but unfortunately, at the time St. George was running around on his as a knight on his horse slaying dragons, I'm not sure that the port he was drinking is what we know it is today. What you have to remember with vintage port, and I didn't mention this earlier,
Yeah.
but vintage port is the port that's used for a loyal toast. So at the end of a meal or at a big state banquet, people raise a glass of vintage port, normally to the monarch or whatever. That's certainly been the tradition here in the UK, or in the UK, which is one of our traditional markets. So vintage port is used for that moment of loyal toast. I'm sure
Huh.
St. George himself would have wanted to raise a glass to monarchy and to his own notoriety in history.
Yeah, and I think he would raise a glass to the 2024 vintage.
I'm sure he would.
All right. Thank you so much, Adrian.
Thanks, Joe. Pleasure to talk to you. Cheerio.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Adrian Bridge of taylor-fladgate. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned why vintage port is so special, and maybe be enticed to take a trip to Portugal. To learn more about port and taylor-fladgate, check the show notes. There are links to the taylor-fladgate website, which includes an excellent and entertaining guide on all things port. If you have the chance, be sure to get a taste of the 2024 vintage port, or better yet, buy a bottle or a case to enjoy over the next 50 years. It's the wine that keeps on giving. To learn more about wine in general, visit wine365.com. I'll be back again with a new episode in about 2 weeks. In the meantime, remember, wine is food. It comes from a place. Enjoy it responsibly.